This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Right, well, great pleasure to welcome everyone here. I hope we can be heard. I think we can. My name is Ron Mitter. I am a specialist, or allegedly anyway, on the history and politics of China, based at Oxford. So it's a great pleasure to be able to slip into a superior institution, at least briefly speaking, certainly superior in terms of the well, grand surroundings that we have here. And we are going to be spending the next hour or so turning the globe a little further to the east in terms of Asia. And we have three speakers who are going to address aspects of JFK and the administration's Asia policy. I'll introduce them briefly now, just before we actually kick off. On my far left, although if anyone else is far left, we have Claudia Castiglioni, who got her PhD at the University of Florence, spent a year at the Hopkins Center in Washington, D.C., and is now teaching at the University of Milan. We have here on my left Matthew Jones, currently based at the University of Nottingham, but he is shaking the dust of the East Midlands from his feet to join the distinguished faculty of the London School of Economics, no less, later this year. And we unfortunately don't have his stablemate, as it were, actually in the era of horsemeat scandals, perhaps I should be wary of that, in the shape of Paul McGarr, who I think is actually quite ill and not here with good reason, so to speak. But Matthew, I think, is going to deliver his paper for him a little later on, hopefully not interspersing it with snorts of disbelief or
Don't ask me questions.
Well, that will allow us more time, of course, perhaps to spread the discussion elsewhere, although we will still make sure that we allow... Yes, we're relying on you for that, Matthew. So the speakers will give us 20 minutes each, and then we will move to a discussion. I guess we will start perhaps on this end, and I'm wondering, Claudia, if you would speak to us about a showcase of modernity in the Third World, JFK and the path of reforms in Iran.
Thank you to the organizers, Professor Matthew, put together. Good afternoon to everybody. Iran must become a model for the growth of democracy and of Western economic ideas in the Middle East and in the Islamic world, a case study of economic development and reform. So this quotation that dates back to early 1961 actually encompasses the spirit and the attitude that featured Kennedy's approach towards Iran at the beginning of his presidency. It also shows us the importance of attached to a country that in the views on the new president was supposed to stand as an incontrovertible proof of the administration's commitment towards development, growth and progress. The choice was not accidental. In the post-war period, Iran represented the perfect example of the developing country, attempting to take advantage of the competition between the United States and USSR in search of its own path to development, but at the same time trying to embody the modernization requested by Washington as a condition for economic and military support. To this extent, the analysis of US-Iranian relations in these days offers an opportunity to explore Washington's approach to the Third World during the Cold War, and to examine some of the problematic aspects of the modernization become by some developing countries and encouraged by the US doctrine of containment through social progress and economic growth. The shift in US policy was bound to be short-lived, was soon replaced to a strong endorsement of the Shah's regime that fully embodied the ambitions for renewal and democracy mentioned in the opening quotation. Starting from these premises, the paper examines the policy designed by the Kennedy administration towards Pahlavi Iran, exploring the challenges and the changes the alliance between Tehran and Washington went through in the early 60s. More specifically, the paper describes the basic premises of Kennedy's approach to Iran and evaluates the effectiveness of Washington's attempt to reassess its policy towards the Third World in order to look at the limitation and contradiction of the modernization theory that propelled the administration's fresh dynamism. The brief premiership of the Western-leaning Ali Amini from May 1961 to July 1962 reflected and embodied some of these limitations and contradictions. as it threw into sharp relief the difficulties the administration encountered in openly supporting an experiment of change in an allied country ruled by an authoritarian regime. The paper is divided into 4 brief parts. The first part is a brief description of the modernization theory as the driving force that animated the approach of the Kennedy administration towards the Third World, its premises and its evolution. The aim is providing the framework in which we can locate, both ideologically and politically, the administration's approach vis-à-vis Iran. The second part is an analysis of the way this approach shaped the policy pursued by the administration towards the regime of Tehran at the beginning of 1961, as the idealism that characterized the administration was at its peak, and the transition towards a more traditional course it embraced after the fall of the Amini premiership in mid-1962. The third part is a brief description of the Shah's reformist project, the White Revolution, launched by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in January 1963, to underline the great role the White Revolution had in the early 1960s in overcoming American fear of Iranian political instability and economic vulnerability. The fourth part, its conclusion, is an assessment of the policy designed by the American administration in reaction to the White Revolution. It will help to draw some conclusion on the elements that mark Kennedy's approach to the Third World reform and the difficult combination, as we said before, between the defense of American interests in the area, the overwhelming demand of energy and resources coming from other theaters, such as obviously Vietnam, but also the domestic front, and the attempt to innovate the political and economic hegemony of Washington in the emerging developing world. As we all know, for the United States, the early 60s marked the beginning of a new form of political, cultural, social, and economic hegemony, the idea of development, used both as a vehicle to contrast with Soviet offensive in the Third World, as a new way to renew the image of the United States. Economic growth and political reformism were regarded as instruments to harness the change produced by the process of decolonisation and to immunize the Third World against the disease of communism. In this cultural and political scenario, the theorists of modernization emerged as the ones who provided the most effective and concrete strategy. Through the elaboration of an analytical framework based on the distinction between traditional and modern society and on the linearity of development, the economist Whitman Rostow and his colleagues legitimized intervention by Washington as a means to foster a natural convergence towards the perfect model of modernity, the American one. This intervention was mostly required in the underdeveloped peripheries, the regions that had just started on the beach's path to progress and therefore were mostly vulnerable to communist contagion. Progressively, the promoters of the theory transformed the support to development from being a premise for progress and stability into an encouragement of forms more or less explicit of political authoritarianism. Disillusioned with the ability of the Third World society to develop democratic and pluralistic political systems and the traditional anti-populism of the United States and of the American elite concurred with the pro-authoritarian drift of the modernization theory. Rostow and the other theorists of modernization started to consider authoritarian leaderships, both of charismatic and military types, as the best the United States could hope for, and in most cases, the only options available. The main consequence was a gradual softening of the social and political credentials required from the leaders of the Third World countries and the attribution of a more explicit priority for stability compared to reformism and social development. As Roland Popes pointed out with regard to the evolution of the theory from its initial calls for liberalization and progress to the more realistic assessment about the priority of development over democratization, the rigidity collapsed when questions of power came to the fore. The analysis of the Iranian cases perfectly embodies the difficult combination of the commitment to liberalism and development, the defense of US interests, and the imperatives of containment on one hand, and the critical relations between growth and stability on the other. In April 1961, the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, proudly declared to the New York Tribune journalist Walter Lippmann, and indirectly to the newly appointed administration, that Iran was ripe for revolution and about to fall into the Soviet camp. Despite all the evidences running contrary to Khrushchev's threat, the words of the Soviet leader had a deep impact on the young American president. Deeply shocked by the evolution of the Cuban crisis, Kennedy's newsfrontiersmen saw in the precariousness of the Iranian situation a test of their credibility, considered as already mentioned this morning, on the international scene, and on their ability to defend the area from the risk of a communist takeover. Their fears derived from the same assumption that has dominated the later Eisenhower years, the conviction that the problems related to Iran did not come from the chance of a shift in the international alignment of the regime, but rather from the risk of a revolution that would facilitate communist penetration of the government and change Iranian position in the bipolar conflict. In this case, as for other third world countries, the Kennedy administration had to evaluate US interests and the risk of a communist expansion through the difficult and misleading prism of the solidity of allied countries, in contrast with the liberal democratic ideas it pursued, at least on the rhetorical level. A few weeks after Kennedy took office, the dramatic evolution of the Iranian domestic situation ended up linking the internal and international dimension of the crisis even more. In May 1961, a series of popular appeals forced the Shah to dismiss the Prime Minister Sharif Hemani and to choose the former ambassador to Washington, Ali Amini, as a new premier. The inauguration of this new Iranian government was followed by the creation of a task force on Iran by the Kennedy administration. It was a clear signal of US intention not to ignore the deterioration of Iranian political situation. The new administration was making a commitment. It would pay more attention to, it would be more involved in the Iranian internal situation. It was a proof that Kennedy had taken Khrushchev's words as a challenge. It was determined to choose Iran as a test case to revert to the inevitable course of history that was in favor of communism. Obviously, I'm quoting Khrushchev's words. In the same month, the State Department began a searching reprisal of US policy towards Iran. This signaled the start of a new season, a fresh dynamism, and a desire to react to Iranian instability with ideas and analysis, replaced the dissatisfaction of the late Eisenhower years. The approach to the Third World, the eagerness to understand and guide change in the post-colonial world, found in Iran one of its most apt and privileged cases of application. The keystone of the project was the launch of a constructive dialogue with the new emerging class in the Iranian political scenario, the professional middle class. US officials and academics converged on the very idea that the middle class, as an emerging force, represented the main source of instability of the country. The category was selected as a privileged interlocutor, able to guide the country through the challenges opened by modernity and progress. And a newly appointed Prime Minister, Ali Amini, with its Western orientation, had been ambassador to Washington. This surely helped his connection with the new administration. His familiarity with American political circles was soon identified as the best spokesman for the new emerging bourgeois. The Kennedy man saw his appointment as the first step of this new phase, and he became the symbol of the widespread hopes of the renewal. The domestic events had the upper hand over American design. In July 1962, after a short period of reform, frustrated by the profound economic crisis and by his weak relations with the Shah, Amini resigned when he failed to come to a compromise on the budgetary issue. The Kennedy administration did not react. It realized that its initial support to the Prime Minister could not be pursued in case it threatened the Shah's one-man rule, and the brief but intense focus on Iran that had characterized the first month of the Kennedy administration was already over. Kennedy and his men turned again their attention to the country only 6 months later, after the launch of the Shah's White Revolution, this time to celebrate the great Iranian reformer now firmly in power, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The shift to the support of the Shah did not undermine the myth of progress and the widespread belief in the symbolic value of modernization as a guiding force. It rather determined a gradual loss of importance for the promoter of the progress, as much for the political framework in which it took place. After Amini resigned, and the Shah's long-term friend Asadullah Alam was appointed Prime Minister, the same support that had been granted to Amini was granted to the Shah. The Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, aware of US concerns, realized that the only way to reinforce his political position was to promote a series of initiatives able to convey to the internal opposition as much as the US ally the launch of a new phase of stability. The goal was to be attained through a comprehensive reassessment of the Iranian social and economic order, and through the elaboration of a new narrative of national identity. In short, the Shah was tempted by the idea of producing a change without precedent, a total revolution necessary to save the country and elevate it to the level of the most advanced society in all times. The Shah regarded economic progress in the capitalistic sense as a crucial element, the new bright phase of Iranian history. He combined it with a certain awareness of the importance of rhetoric and the psychological dimension of the program for its outcomes. A first step, as we mentioned in the introduction, towards the creation of this new Iran was the launch in January 1963 of the so-called White Revolution. Though presented as a radical and unprecedented turn in Iranian history, the reformist plan launched by the Shah under this label of White Revolution was actually part of a long-term plan envisioned by the monarch as a powerful strategy to consolidate the regime. Since the late 50s, some elements within this establishment have started to consider the idea of a wide-reaching program designed to strengthen the regime's power and image both abroad and at home. The ultimate goal was the promotion of a series of initiatives able to convey the launch of a new phase of stability and autonomy of the regime. 10 years after the coup that had revealed to the world its weakness, the Mossadegh crisis of 1953, the Shah started to think about a new phase of stability and was tempted by the idea of producing a change without precedent, aimed to radically transform the foundation of Iranian society. A revolutionary, I'm quoting from the Shah's memoirs, a revolution obviously necessary to save the country and elevate it to the level of the most advanced country in the West. During the implementation, however, the project took an unprecedented course, unexpected course. The Shah was trapped by the fear that the fall from above rapidly fell up in a revolution from below, what actually happened 15 years later, and proposed a series of measures whose explicit aim was to provide more flexibility in the realization of the plan. The second round of provisions illustrated the intrinsic contradictions that weakened the entire project. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was trying on one hand to strengthen his control over the productive sectors of the country, and on the other, to champion a program of social and economic reform aimed at guiding the change according to the principle of social renewal embodied in his demagogic campaign. The outcome was an essentially defensive program centered on the growing intervention of the government in rural affairs, conceived as a challenge to the traditional system and as an attempt to modernize the country that would be able to cast off the joke of feudalism. White Revolution could have managed to create the foundation for a new stability of the regime, but it would have cost for the regime itself. Unable to accept this cost, the Shah ended up starting a new and in some ways unexpected dynamics that without a system that challenged them eventually put a growing pressure on the regime. US policymakers paid scant attention to the side effects that, as mentioned before, were among the main reasons for the revolution that obviously brought to the collapse of the regime in 1979. The Kennedy administration, confronted with the evolution of the Iranian situation, decided to support this modernization, a perfect example of the model of revolution through progress, as it was being promoted in the Third World. The simple cooptation of fewer elements from the middle class in the ruling elite, the adoption of a more enlightened rhetoric, and the launch of an impressive plan of industrialization were considered good starting points for an easy transformation into an advanced country. It was the reform from above that Washington wanted, and the Shah was the strong man such job demanded. The launch of the White Revolution closed the phase of reassessment of the bilateral relations that had started with the creation of the task force in May 1961, and revealed the administration's ability to come to compromise with local leaders. As has been pointed out, the Kennedy men were not foregoing political reform in favor of economic reform, but just calibrating their goals to a new political terrain. In some respect, the fall of Amini constituted evidence of the difficulties Washington encountered in handling a form of ambiguous and unclear influence on the Iranian political scene, and above all, in comprehending its limitation, something that could be applied not just to the Iranian case, but in many other third world cases. The result of the identification, even for a few months, with the experiment of change embodied by the Prime Minister, was to force the American policy into a paternalistic approach, aimed at supporting the new generation of modern politicians, like Amini, without a formal commitment, which would have alienated the ruling autocrats. This ended up weakening instead of strengthening American projection, leaving it constantly lurking between the traditional instruments of hard power and the aspiration of a more innovative approach. To prevail, as again Bob has pointed out, was the anti-communist as always, even though enlightenment. The White Revolution turned out to be the key element that legitimized the retreat from the initial interventionism and the return to more traditional support for the Shah during the last phase of the Kennedy years, from July 1962 to the end of 1963. Backing the White Revolution allowed Iran to slip down the new frontier agenda and the US to step away from the impasse into which their interference in Iranian internal dynamics and idealistic approach had placed them. With the endorsement of the Shah's policy and their enthusiastic appraisal of an Iranian revolution, able to evolve with Persian timing towards Persian outcomes, and I'm quoting a State Department document, the members of the Kennedy administration felt reassured. They thought they had brought to a close the insidious course started with the mini experiment. While it's true that the White Revolution, in some ways, was able to meet the spirit of the new frontier and to co-opt Kennedy's administration, it's also true that the Shah managed to get their endorsement mostly through a rhetoric and a language that could be easily fitted in the new policy adopted by the administration. The language of the revolution, therefore, turned out to be far more important than the fulfillment of the project it was unlikely designed to describe. In this sense, the new course of the Kennedy administration turned out to be mostly abstract and episodic. Even if during the Kennedy administration new ideas and categories emerged, sign of an intellectual dynamism, the effect of this awakening to US internationalism and the new activism against the logic of reaction was not necessarily positive or easily adoptable. The result, therefore, as the Iranian case shows, was often to place the US policy within the insidious field of reformism from above, forcing the application of the categories of Western political science to society with autonomous developments, mostly read according to the rigid categories of the modernization theory. Despite the evident limits in the new approach toward the Third World, it would be unfair to dismiss the cause for deeper involvement in the post-colonial world, the Third World, as simply a rhetorical strategy, even in presence of a temporary and fortunate link between revolution in social science, electoral consideration, frustration for the shortcomings of the Eisenhower administration. The Kennedy design started from a real project. Maybe undermined from its very beginning, Kennedy's contributed to an awake of American internal administration toward theater and issues that for decades were considered as marginal. In this maybe lays one of the main legacies of this presidency, with all the limitation and the contradiction it symbolized, but also with the profound assessment of the very idea of foreign policy it managed to inaugurate. Thank you.